Hello For the Wild community, Ayana here, and before we explore the island wolves of British Columbia with Ian McALLISTER, I wanted to share a few updates. Spring is turning out to be quite a busy season this year. I'll actually be leaving my beloved Cougar Mountain in just a few weeks to spend a month on the road, dreaming and scheming with some incredible comrades. First, I'll be teaching at the Northern California Women's Herbal Conference on the weekend of May 18th, then off to the Spirit Weavers Gathering in Southern Oregon for the first 2 weeks of June. From there, I'll be jumping to Detroit for the Allied Media Conference and ending the month in Washington at the Protecting Mother Earth Conference presented by Indigenous Environmental Network and hosted by the Nisqually Nation. I'd love to see who of the For the Wild community will be at these fabulous events. Also, if you're interested in our reciprocity retreat in July, email engage@forthewild.world. There's only a few spots left. Last but not least, For the Wild podcast and the collective of folks who are behind the scenes rely on your contributions to keep the shows rolling. Consider making a donation at forthewild.world. All right, now on to the show.
I often think that wolves are just waiting for humans to really get their act together and to start to look at the natural world in a different way, and one that is based much more on respect.
The silence is broken by somebody crying, trying to be heard, never a word. Always the attitude, sort out your own, always alone, wishing for something the world is denying. Out in the wilderness somebody's crying. Somebody wishing for something to happen, wishing to tell, wishing to help. Someone was listening, someone who cared, never despaired. Someone to lean on and someone to trust, who needs your assistance and finds your disgust.
Hello and welcome to For the Wild podcast. I'm Ayana Young. Today we will be speaking with Ian McALLISTER. Ian is co-founder and executive director of Pacific Wild, a nonprofit located in the heart of the Great Bear Rainforest, committed to defending wildlife and their habitat on Canada's Pacific coast. He is an award-winning photographer and author of 6 books, and his images have appeared in publications around the world. Ian is a member of the International League of Conservation Photographers and a recipient of the North America Nature Photography Association's Vision Award and the Rainforest Action Network's Rainforest Hero Award. He and his wife Karen were named by Time magazine amongst leaders of the 21st century for their efforts to protect British Columbia's endangered rainforest. He lives with his family on an island in the heart of the Great Bear Rainforest. Well, hello, Ian. My warmest welcomes to you. Thank you so much for joining us on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me, and my pleasure to speak with you today.
Well, it's an honor to be speaking with somebody who knows as intimately as you do the rugged coast of northern British Columbia, a land where mountain and sea are inseparable, and ancient relationships that benefit the whole, such as salmon and bear, or wolf and raven, still hold on. And we at For the Wild feel a call to rally for the protection of these northern lands and waters that shelter the last intact stretches of temperate rainforests on the planet. And we're soon launching a campaign to end old-growth logging in the Tongass National Forest of southeast Alaska, for we believe it's our public responsibility to protect these irreplaceable ancient forests, especially as U.S. taxpayer dollars continue to fund their slaughter. And in this time where human civilization is quick to suffocate any land that still clings on to their wildness, we're truly devoted to multi-species justice and the protection of as much wildland as possible. And the temperate rainforest is just so dear to our hearts. So, Ian, you have devoted your life to being a voice for the incredible species that call these disappearing slivers of old-growth home. And I'm so grateful for your work and the work of everyone at Pacific Wild. So, truthfully, there is so much we would love to ask you about in this interview, from current logging practices in the Great Bear Rainforest to ecosystem health amidst the death throes of oil development, nuclear fallout and climate change, salmon farming, even the recent ban on the trophy hunting of grizzlies, marine protection of Great Bear waters. Honestly, the list goes on. It feels right to let the wolf cultures that gifted you their trust steer this conversation. So with the help of their salmon kin, these island wolves, they blur the boundaries between marine and terrestrial and are the ultimate testament to wild functioning ecosystems. The lives of these wolves are astonishingly rare, for they have persisted on this coastline uninterrupted for thousands of years, despite the murderous fear of colonizers that led to the extirpation of wolves throughout the vast majority of Turtle Island. So, Ian, would you begin by telling us a bit about the wolf families you hold dear? What do the island territories of these apex predators look like, and how have their pack traditions, behavior, and morphology been shaped as much by the sea as by the rainforest?
Yeah, those are wonderful questions, and something that we've been studying and trying to really better understand. What's incredible about this whole central or north coast of British Columbia, what's known as the Great Bear Rainforest, is that it very much is a massive archipelago. So it's probably over 1,000 islands uninhabited by humans today that have been functioning, very much in an unbroken, unfragmented way since the glaciers receded from this coastline. And wolves have been a dominant apex species, predator species, on these islands. Other than the offshore islands of Haida Gwaii, where wolves have not existed historically, virtually all of the other islands up and down this entire coast are inhabited, or at least claimed, by packs of wolves. So the ocean influence on these terrestrial mammals has been significant and also long-standing. And I think it's probably one of the more surprising ecological attributes of these wolves that still remains largely unstudied, largely unknown. But how much of the ocean actually influences the behavior and morphology and culture of these extended families or packs of wolves. And what we've observed over the last 20 or so years is that it's significant. For some packs, over 70% of their diet comes from the ocean. So in the fall season, these wolves are showing up on the same salmon rivers almost at the same time, coinciding with the annual salmon spawning migration. And they're feeding on salmon almost exclusively for as long as the runs last, which is sometimes 2.5 or 3 months. So salmon is a huge part of their diet. We just come in from 3 weeks on the herring spawning grounds, documenting this incredible natural history event where tons and tons of herring come inshore to spawn in the intertidal zone. And one of the great treats of documenting this season is being on the beaches at the same time that packs of wolves emerge from the forest to feed on the little tiny herring eggs that are exposed at low tide. And they'll be feeding, even today they're still out there feeding on herring eggs every time the tide goes down. They're feasting on them, and that will go on for at least 3 weeks to a month. So just another example of how the ocean is influencing and feeding terrestrial life. And of course, there's offshore packs of wolves that live on these really rugged, windswept islands, and they walk the perimeter of their islands every day or every few days, searching for beached whale carcasses. And they're also preying successfully on seals, harbor seals, and even sea otters and mink. And there's some wolves that specialize in digging for clams and flipping over rocks for intertidal critters like, small crabs and chitons and belemnies and all kinds of other intertidal life. What at first I thought that this was maybe sort of incidental or opportunistic behavior, and why not? Why wouldn't a wolf eat marine food? But as the years have gone on and we've done more intensive studies and spent much more time in the field directly observing these wolves, we realize that there's nothing opportunistic or incidental about this behavior, that this is a very long-standing relationship between wolves and the ocean, and it's in fact one of the reasons that has shaped the very DNA of these animals. They're incredible swimmers, and we've documented individual wolves swimming over 10 kilometers of open ocean, and this is cold water with a lot of current, and other packs that are swimming a few miles of open ocean on a weekly basis as they explore their home territories, which is often comprised of numerous islands. So, we used to think that islands was maybe a barrier or a natural boundary for a pack's territory, but again, not the case there. Individual packs are claiming archipelagos of islands and islets as part of their home territory. So the ocean has been very much a key contributor to the health and prosperity of these wolves, and one of the reasons why these coastal wolves maybe have some of the highest pup survivorship rate of any wolves in the whole Arctic, or where wolves exist in the northern hemisphere, is partly because of this predictable and nutritious and quite easily accessible food. So if you consider salmon swim right to the wolves, and they don't kick back like a deer or a moose. So it's easily accessible, nutritious, and predictable, which is another contributing factor to the fact that these wolves may be supported in the temperate rainforest in some of the highest densities of any wolves in the world. So there's lots of superlatives and unique ways to describe these amazing predators, yeah.
These island wolves, they also are guardians of genetic diversity. Can you speak about the human-caused genetic bottleneck faced by wolves elsewhere on Turtle Island, and why the genetic diversity carried by these island wolves is crucial for the longevity and resilience of wolves everywhere?
Yeah, I think this is the most fascinating parts of the molecular research that has been conducted on this wolf population. This is a collaboration between Canadian universities and universities in the United States and Sweden. And after exhaustive hair collection and scat collection and genetic analysis of these wolves, scientists were astounded to find this incredibly high level of genetic diversity that was still present within these wolf populations. And it's not to say that these wolves deserve to be a separate subspecies, which would be a debate among scientists, but they certainly have maintained and held the genetic diversity that has been lost in other wolf populations. Wolves have been extirpated in so many parts of their former range and have been just viciously persecuted in the most brutal, unimaginable ways by humans ever since they landed in North America from Europe. Because of this huge loss and because of this constant annual mortality wreaked upon wolves by humans, the genetic diversity has been lost. And so, imagine 30, 40, 50% or even higher mortality rates of wolf populations every single year. We've really been forcing them through a genetic bottleneck. And it's no different than if someone came to planet Earth and started killing 30 to 40 to 50% of the human population every year. We eventually would lose our languages and our skin colors and the genetic diversity that makes humans so diverse on this planet. And it's no different with what has happened with wolves. So unfortunately, the genetic diversity has been lost in wolves from the prairies to the north to almost everywhere, even in Southeast Alaska in the Tongass, because of the high level of roads the density of roads that have been built there has given humans access to unprecedented amounts of the Tongass National Forest, and those wolves even have been reduced in levels of genetic diversity. Yet here on the BC coast, because the road density, at least on the north coast, has been relatively sparse, and First Nations are still living within their traditional territories, and there's been a long history of respect between First Nations here and wolves. Wolves have been very, very much revered and is showcased in their culture and their totems and stories and art. And there's, wolves are described in these ancient stories as protectors and providers. So very different worldview of wolves than what Europeans have brought to North America. So wolves have been protected for a long time here, have been respected, but also Europeans have not had access to them because this forest is still largely intact. The roads have not been built into these last wild areas. So wolves have been able to avoid the complete disharmony and persecution that their continental kin have been suffering for hundreds of years. And so they've been able to harbor and safeguard the genetic diversity that's been lost in other wolf populations. So these wolves, in many respects, really give us a window or entry point into understanding wolves of the past in an unbroken, unfragmented lineage.
Thank goodness for them. Thank goodness for these places that have been left unroaded. And I know that's a big topic in the Tongass National Forest with the roadless rule and the fear that our current administration could topple that over and what that would do to wolf populations and intact old-growth forest is undescribably frightening. So thank you for bringing up those points. And I'm thinking about you in these places and that you've spent hundreds and hundreds of days in this forest alone, contending with drenching rain and hurricane force winds, really gaining the trust of these elusive wolf packs. And I imagine that you crossing a threshold from the realm of conditioned, civilized human into the world of animal, a world that relies on heightened senses and intuition and a real delicateness of how you carry yourself. Yet the fact that you were accepted as, just another resident of the watershed, like the cranes or the kingfishers, speaks to the fact that these wolves have not been heavily spoiled by human civilization. So I'd love to hear about how the wolves kept you in check and how you kept your boundaries, knowing that habituating wolves to humans inherently endangers them.
Yeah, really good points. Fortunately, many of the wolf packs that I've been spending time with over the last couple of decades live in really remote, difficult to access locations and have very little impact with or cross paths very seldomly with humans. So there's less of a concern with habituation. But what seems consistent with the relationship that I have with individuals and with packs of wolves is that there's something far deeper and more profound about the idea that they're merely tolerating a human in their presence. It's something I think that has just existed on this coast for well over 10,000 years. And if you think about all of the prime areas where the traditional village sites are located, they're still in the same present day home core territories of packs of wolves. So and some of that is just simple biological needs, that the needs of wolves overlaps that with the needs of humans. So humans are always looking for access to fresh water and old growth forests and clam beaches and salmon rivers and protection from the winter storms and basic ecological values that overlap between human and wolves. But there's something also much deeper than that. And I think that wolves and humans once shared this landscape seamlessly, and that has largely been broken today. And the interest in the long-held behavior of of wanting to share this territory with humans is still very much part of the culture of wolves today. And it's really remarkable. Like, we've had many researchers working for us over the years who have been out collecting hair samples or scat samples or doing transects for deer and different things in the field. And some of them are 100-pound females, and suddenly they find themselves right unexpectedly in the middle of a den site with pups, running around at their feet. And there may be somewhere between 7 and 10 adults who just move away and literally abandon their pups. Hopefully the pups hide in a den. But the point being that this has happened so many times, and I've had the same experience countless times. But I've never ever been attacked or shown aggression by wolves, even going into their most sacred spots, such as their pup rearing areas. And that's really remarkable when I've seen wolves without even thinking twice attack a full grown grizzly bear that wandered into one of their den sites, or a black bear or a moose. And these are animals that are capable of protecting themselves, inflicting far more damage than an unarmed human being ever could. The natural reaction, almost without fail, is for wolves to not attack, and that again is, I don't think that's learned behavior, because these are wolves that have not had close encounters with humans, but it's something again that's within. And I often think that wolves are just waiting for humans to really get their act together and to start to look at the natural world in a different way, and one that is based much more on respect. And wolves unfortunately have suffered from some of the worst marketing of almost any animal, maybe next to sharks, on the planet. And people fear them. Many people just hate them and want to rid them of the landscape. And we certainly see that with provincial government policies here in British Columbia, where wolves are treated virtually like vermin. So open season hunting, open season trapping, there's no mandatory reporting or compulsory inspection of wolves that are killed. You don't need a special license to kill wolves in British Columbia. Anyone with a hunting license can just go out and kill a wolf, or in many parts of BC, as many wolves as they want. So wolves are treated virtually like vermin still today. Not respected at all for the function that they play in the ecosystem, and as such highly social, incredibly intelligent animals that we could learn a lot from.
I want to ask some more details about this government-led wolf killing. And in 2014, BC released a wolf management plan that encompassed a government-sponsored cull, with January to April 2015 seeing the murder of 84 wolves by government contractors from helicopters in southeastern BC. And this was all under the guise of protecting two populations of mountain caribou nearing extinction. So I want to ask where this wolf cull program stands now, and also why the argument for, quote, ungulate enhancement is misguided and is a detachment or a detraction from the critical requirement that deer, elk, and wolves all have for old-growth forests.
Yeah, well, I think the wolf cull that is going on right now in British Columbia is the perfect example of our misguided attempts around wildlife management, but also illustrates best our sort of this government-sponsored, it's really a deep-seated hatred of wolves. And, they ostensibly say that they're spending millions of dollars on eradicating wolves from large parts of British Columbia, especially around the Peace River area and the Selkirks in southern British Columbia, because they blame wolves as disproportionately preying upon endangered caribou herds. So they are putting snipers in helicopters, and it's actually worse than that. It's one of the most insidious things I think I've ever heard of, but they actually they'll trap a member or two from a pack of wolves, and they'll put a radio collar on it. And then they'll follow that, when the winter snows come, they'll follow that wolf by radio collar through satellite beacons and whatnot. And they call them Judas wolves because the wolves, when they rejoin the rest of their pack, then the helicopters go in the air and they shoot them from the air and kill them in the deep snow. Many of them are wounded, left to suffer. But this is how they're killing hundreds and hundreds of wolves in British Columbia right now. So, yes, extremely offensive way one of the most cruel methods of killing wolves is being conducted right now. They're in year 4 of a 5-year kill program, and they're saying that they'll probably just continue it for years to come. But what's so tragic about this is that wolves are being scapegoated for government negligence and habitat protection for these woodland caribou herds. These are old-growth dependent animals that eat the lichens of old-growth trees. And it's these trees that have been systematically cut down for fiber. They've been all the roads have been accessed for mines, for oil and gas, for countless industries, even helicopter skiing operations. All of this critical high elevation habitat has been modified. And so at the end of the day, when the federal government says, because of our Species at Risk Act, you've got to do something to save these endangered caribou herds, the only real substantive action that the provincial government is taking here in British Columbia is to spend millions of dollars to kill wolves. And that's their answer to saving ungulates. And by all accounts, by independent scientists, this simply will not save these remnant herds. They are doomed to destruction in the absence of substantive habitat protection. And unfortunately, that's not what's happening right now. And wolves are paying the ultimate price for government inaction.
Gosh, how many countless times do we see species or even indigenous peoples being scapegoated for really what extractive industries is to blame for? Say, what you were talking about, the old growth forest, it's not the wolves that are killing the last ungulates. It's the fact that industry has slaughtered the homelands of these ungulates. That's what they need. They need habitat. And it's so incredible to see this human supremacy and the invasiveness of it coming in and blaming everything but industry, everything but development, everything but habitat destruction. And I see it all the time, and it's really frustrating. Another thing that you brought up was the radio collaring. And in your book, Following the Last Wild Wolves, you describe how before you grew a relationship with wolves, you thought that they couldn't be studied except by invasive radio and satellite telemetry techniques. But your mind clearly changed, and I loved reading about the holistic approach of the Rainforest Wolf Project that was not only grounded in the oral history of the Heiltsuk, but also that the team used observational and molecular techniques that you've been speaking about so far, the analyzing scat and hair that the wolves left behind. Since then, the team has minimized its impact even further with the advent of remote-controlled video cameras. But radio collaring is still commonplace, whether that's with wolves, bears, etc. And I'm wondering, why is radio collaring so widely accepted, not with so much the helicopter killing, but why is it so accepted in wildlife biology? And have you seen radio collaring traumatize individual animals or disrupt pack dynamics or lead to information that is inconclusive or even misrepresentative?
Another great question. And in the inception, when we started more formal studies of coastal wolves, we asked ourselves those questions. Would we learn more doing telemetry or satellite-based radio collaring with wolves, and would we learn more than sort of this molecular approach where it's non-invasive? And at the end of the day, the main point was that we know through other studies, both with grizzly bears or other large carnivores, that they frequently die in the traps or misuse of drugs, sedatives. There's all kinds of things that can happen in the trapping process that could lead to death, and I think that would be just unacceptable when there's an alternative, and through intensive, and it means a lot more people days. It means a lot more people in the field over a longer period of time. But the information gathered is essentially the same. We're learning where animals are moving through the landscape when you're able to tell so much about their diet from a single follicle of hair, or of course through scat analysis. We're able to tell stress levels, and there's so many things that can now be told through non-invasive techniques such as mark recapture methods and DNA extraction from hair or scat. So it just seemed like a logical way to go. Having said that, it's an incredible amount of field work that's needed, but we've just worked with incredible people, and with the support and direction of local First Nations, we've uncovered a tremendous amount of information about local wildlife, and wolves are, as an apex predator that is awake rather year-round, unlike, say, grizzly bears that are asleep for half the year. They're telling us about the health of the rainforest and the health of even the ocean environment. So we're learning much more about broader ecosystems than just wolves themselves.
Well, speaking about more than just wolves, I'd love to turn the conversation to salmon, this life-giving thread that weaves and feeds the watered and forested tapestry of Cascadia. And in Following the Last Wild Wolves, your book, you write, quote, "The salmon-wolf relationship is one that should be measured in evolutionary timeframes," end quote. So I'd love if you could elaborate on this ancient relationship and how it's faring as industrial logging, industrial fishing, and human development have chopped, degraded, and disconnected the great marine terrestrial interface of the Northwest coast. A secondary question would be, how are the small streams and watershed diversity indispensable to the longevity of all species of the bioregion and the Northwest coast?
When you consider how important salmon as a food source is for these coastal wolves, and the fact that behavior and association outside of these indigenous communities largely unknown until recently, it makes me realize how many mysteries are left to uncover in the rainforest. And again, it's similar to the association between herring and wolves, and seals and wolves and other marine sources. The relationship between salmon and wolves is a very ancient one. Even some of the behavior or catching methods that wolves deploy to actually catch a salmon has been studied, and what it shows is that, again, that the way the wolves move and the way they swing their tail and arc their back when they actually catch a salmon has been shown to be something that could not have evolved in a short amount of time, that, this is something that has been playing out in these remote creeks and river valleys for thousands of years. So it's incredible to think of, how the ocean has been feeding so much life in the rainforest here for such a long period of time. And especially because, we see that even with jurisdictional, governance of the marine environment and the terrestrial environment here on the west coast of Canada, because the provincial government has jurisdiction over land decisions in the rainforest, but the federal government have jurisdiction over everything in the marine environment. And they rarely see eye to eye or agree, but the idea that we have actually delineated this clear political boundary and jurisdictional boundary between the ocean and rainforest, when everything that we witness here shows sort of this interface that is seamless. It's like this marriage and interaction that just flows back and forth with the currents and tide, and how terrestrial animals go into the ocean to feed, and how marine life like salmon penetrate hundreds and even thousands of kilometers into the interior to spawn, bringing all of that marine-based nutrients into the terrestrial world, and how even nutrients being carried in the wind is fueling productivity in the old-growth forests themselves. And there's this constant conveyor belt of nutrients going back and forth. So the idea that we can somehow separate these two worlds just no longer makes any sense. And we really should be protecting more of the ocean environment in order to protect more of the rainforest species that exist there, and vice versa.
What do you see the biggest threat being to the salmon, the wolves, and their relationship to one another and to the greater web of rainforest species? And do you find one of these threats to be nuclear fallout from the explosion at Fukushima a few years ago?
Traveling and living and working in this area, there's been just this nonstop roller coaster of massive industrial threats that face this place. And perhaps that it's such a beautiful place that everyone wants a piece of it, and that's certainly been the case here. And there's, whether it's the fish farming industry wanting to expand throughout this whole area, putting harmful impacts on wild salmon, or offshore oil and gas exploration, or pipelines bringing bitumen and massive tanker traffic that would follow, to the ongoing deforestation, to there's just been so many big threats that have come here. And then, of course, the incredible tsunami that happened, and what are the impacts on the coast from the radiation? I don't think anybody really fully understands it. I certainly don't, but people certainly question, is it safe to be eating the seaweed here? Are the fish safe? What are the long-term impacts from that kind of a environmental catastrophe? So there's certainly unknowns, and it's, I think, very, very challenging, because it's hard to imagine what we could do about it other than being forced not to eat from the ocean, which would be devastating for local communities here.
Ocean carry me away, bear me off to the one I love, and with her I'm gonna stay. around me, looking for a life to save. Thanks to you, I feel alive again. Look at all the things you gave. Rolling waves crashing on the stone, ocean carrying me away. Bear me off to the one I love, and with her I'm gonna stay.
Last summer, I interviewed Jody Holmes about the Great Bear Agreement and how this immense effort of diverse coalitions work to fully protect 30% of the Great Bear's monumental river valleys and islands. Yet you've seen the brutal alteration of these forests continue, and in response, Pacific Wild calls for greater protection of the Great Bear, noting how the original agreement fell short of adequately protecting wolf territory as well as the marine environment, like you've been speaking of. So from what I understand, the remaining 70% that is not under full protection is managed under an experimental process called ecosystem-based management. And while EBM is said to protect cultural and ecological values, roads are still built, sport hunting and mining are still allowed. And to be honest, I question the reality of on-the-ground surveying and operations. Anecdotally, I've heard that it is often more profitable to turn a blind eye to cultural or biological artifacts, whose notice would actually prohibit logging operations. With all that in mind, could you speak to why the conservation of large, intact, roadless areas is vital for wildlife, which you've mentioned about the wolves and the salmon, but also for climate change? And perhaps if you'd like to describe your feelings about EBM and the need to protect more of the Great Bear and maybe even ways in which you see that being possible.
Incredibly, as I've been just talking about some of the relationships between the ocean and the terrestrial environment, today we still have protected only about 1% of our marine ecosystems in our jurisdictional waters of the west coast of Canada. So we've got so far to go in order to adequately protect the marine environment. We're still bottom trawling, which is virtually like open pit mining of the bottom of the ocean. We are the unsustainable fisheries, whether it's shellfish or salmon or herring, continues. There's so many issues facing our oceans right now, and by all accounts, the oceans have far exceeded their ability to be resilient given what is happening throughout the world's oceans, but it's no different here on the west coast of Canada. So certainly a lot of work left to be done on that front, and it's something that Pacific Wild and other organizations, First Nation communities are focused on in the near future. When it comes to protection of the rainforest, this is an area where there's been a tremendous amount of work to bring attention to the plight of these old growth forests. Temperate rainforests only historically occupied about 0.1% of the Earth's landmass, and most of what's left intact and unprotected is found here on the west coast, the north coast of British Columbia and southeast Alaska. But the fallback position that unfortunately was reached was that there would be about 30% of the coast put into solid protection, the kind of protection you would expect out of like a national park or a conservancy area. So, not off limits to logging, mining, road building, etc. But then there's 70% that was placed into what's called ecosystem-based management. And this, as you said, really is an experimental way of managing humans in the landscape. And it's still long-term rotational forestry. There's still old-growth logging allowed to occur in it, and road building. Salmon watersheds can still be logged. It should not be considered a surrogate for core protection, and that's been one of our main criticisms of the EBM approach. And it also hasn't been carried out over an appropriate amount of time in other jurisdictions. So we could actually look at those places and agree, is that a model that we would like to follow? So there's a lot of problems still, a lot of outstanding issues left to protect adequate levels of old growth forests here on the BC coast.
Well, we're with you on that. And I yearn for a ferocious conservation, more land conserved, because I'm just watching the development in rural areas where I live, and honestly all up to Alaska from Northern California. And it's really devastating to see places that were once wild then turned into logging lands and then turned into parking lots, basically, especially in southern British Columbia, Vancouver Island and such. And the other part, though, of me thinks about conservation in a different lens. And some people think that conservation should include land or wilderness that is completely untouchable to humans. But then this is contentious, as conservation can be a form of modern colonization, restricting ancient lifeways of indigenous peoples. Conservation on BC's coast seems to be a space for reconciliation in recent years, with initiatives led and guided by First Nations. But I'm wondering, in your experience, how have you seen conservation be imperialistic or regenerative for relationship building between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples?
I think that is certainly one area that has certainly played out and continues to play out here. And when I think of the first years that began exploring this part of the coast and getting to know some of the First Nation communities, the difference then to now is dramatic. There was, First Nations were seen as an impediment to industry accessing trees and marine resources, to the point today where, backed by so many important precedent-setting cases that have shown clearly through the court systems, the highest court of Canada, supporting First Nations rights and title, that this is unceded territory and that the government has an obligation to not only consult, but basically listen to First Nations in how marine and lands are managed. And so there's been a transformative era that has taken place here over the last 20 years, I would say, where First Nations are now driving their own respective marine and land use plans. And that's been a huge step in the right direction. Reconciliation is a term that is used loosely by the federal government and probably industry. I would say, based on what I hear from First Nation communities, is that there is such a long ways to go on that front. But it is heading in that direction, not quick enough. The land use plans that were agreed to here have been largely supported by First Nations, so that I think is extremely positive. But I think the one thing that is consistent and that we should all be grateful for is that the mutual interests and desire of each of these Indigenous communities on the coast is very much about protecting their traditional territories. And when you look at these small communities in the Great Bear Rainforest, they're still situated in the heart of their traditional territories that they have claimed ownership over for many, many thousands of years. And the health of these areas is directly related to the health of the human communities, and that's not lost on anyone here. So I think that's what has to give us the most hope for this coast. And we've seen when these places are threatened, whether it's by pipelines or offshore oil companies or fish farm companies, etc., we have seen the strength and resilience of these communities in protecting their lands and waters. And that's not going to change. In fact, it's only getting stronger. The cultural strength of these Indigenous communities is getting stronger and stronger. And so if there's a part of planet Earth that we can be hopeful for, I'd have to think that this is one of them. Because of its relatively low population, human population, because of its strong Indigenous population, and still the full suite of flora and fauna that exists here, still functioning, albeit at a less abundance than historically would have been found here. But nevertheless, the pieces are still here. So we're not talking about having to try to rebuild something or figure out how to make an ecosystem that has been destroyed come back again. It's not about restoration or revival. It's about really just protecting what we have here. And that is the most cost-effective and, in fact, the only way that we can protect ecosystems, because truthfully, we don't understand how this entire web of life actually works and functions. What we do know is that if we can protect it and protect enough of it, and that's why protecting more rainforest, more of the marine environment, is essential to the long-term resiliency when things that are coming to this coast from other parts of the world, such as radiation from tsunamis and nuclear facilities, et cetera, acidification and ocean temperature regime changes, and a host of other things that are affecting this coastline from outside. The more we can protect of this place, the more resiliency and tolerance will be built into it. So protecting as much as possible is the key to the future here.
I couldn't agree more, Ian. And as we come to the close of this incredible conversation, the wolves are back in my mind. And at the beginning of this conversation, you contrasted the misguided and ruthless way that colonizers viewed and still view wolves compared to the First Nations cultures of the coast that have lived in reverence alongside them for millennia. Wolves, like you said, were honored as messengers, providers, and protectors. And perhaps one of the most visceral pieces from your stories is when you tell of the beyond coincidental findings of the den sites within the old Heiltsuk village sites. That more than 50% of the den sites your team identified was within or in very close proximity to ancient villages. And although humans and wolves do have similar requirements for food and shelter as top-level animals, you pose that it's not that simple. And you wrote, quote, "I don't doubt that the ancestors of these wolves lived with the ancestors of the Heiltsuk people here. When these wolves let us into their lives, are they waiting for us to rediscover that relationship?" End quote. It's just such an incredible feeling to sit with after this conversation. And my heart wants humans to rekindle that relationship, to find once again our humble role as fellow companions of the forest. But I wonder if this wolf-human relationship will ever be possible in light of the current trajectory of modern civilization. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yes, well, you can only hope so. And, sometimes especially when you sort of view what is happening on this planet through the eyes of a species like a wolf, it's heartbreaking, really. But then I also think of, where we were 20-something years ago or 30-something years ago in terms of societal values and how we judged and valued species like wolves. And it's changed dramatically. And I know in our own conservation work, there are an incredible amount of people around the world who have a very deep, strong affinity for animals like wolves and want to see them protected. And when you think about the advances in science and our understanding of wolves and how they actually facilitate and protect and provide critical function for broader ecosystems, and if wolves are removed from the landscape, then we see this cascade of impacts that happen within the ecosystem. And so, there's much greater recognition of wolves and the important role that they play in ecosystem function today than there were not many years ago. And while it seems a little too slow and sometimes a little too late, there's hope for it. One of the things that Pacific Wild is trying to do is to get wolves, these coastal wolves, recognized for their genetic uniqueness and to hopefully provide better protection so that they're not trapped or they're not shot indiscriminately, and that their habitat needs are looked after as well. So that there's still work to be done on that front, but a lot of the groundwork has been done, and I think that public and societal values around supporting these types of initiatives have increased a lot over the last few years. It was pretty tough to try to get the government's attention or anyone's attention about actually protecting wolves not long ago. And today that's changed, not fully, but it's changed. So yes, there's still hope. And the fact that these wolves still exist here as much as they have for many, many thousands of years, it's quite a remarkable thing, all things considered. So we're extremely fortunate, more work to be done, and looking forward to making more progress on wolf conservation and other conservation issues in the future here.
Wow, Ian, thank you so much for your work. And for any of the listeners who want to learn more about wolf conservation and all the work that you're doing up in northern British Columbia, they can go to pacificwild.org, which is your organization. And thank you. And I'm just waiting with bated breath to head north this summer to get some more information and speak with more people about the Tongass National Forest campaign. And so perhaps I'll be coming through your area and we'll get to meet in person.
Very much look forward to that, and love to show you some of the local haunts around here, and I hope you get a chance to get lost in the rainforest and on your journey. And thanks again for having me and on your show, and yeah, very much look forward to our paths crossing.
Thank you for listening to For the Wild podcast. I'm Ayana Young. The music you heard today was from Kitchen Dwellers and Rumpke Mountain Boys. Our theme music is Silence Returns by Bo and Like a River from Kate Wolf. I'd like to thank our wonderful podcast team, Andrew Storrs on editing and production, Madison Magulski, our research director and podcast wrangler, Molly Lebove, our fabulous media director, and Francesca Glassbell with research assistance. To learn more about the Tongass campaign that we mentioned in the episode, head over to forthewild.world. Also, consider making a contribution and signing up for our newsletter while you're there. And rate us on iTunes if you haven't already. All right, thanks so much, and until next week.